Hi everyone, I'm Octavia Marsh. I'm the Executive Director of Hanover Cares. With Hanover Cares, we're dedicated to eliminating the use of alcohol, nicotine, and other drugs among Hanover County youth, and we do that through education and community collaboration. So today this presentation is geared specifically to you as first responders, and we're going to discuss the impacts on you all from a community substance use disorder perspective. So just a little bit more about Hanover Cares. As a coalition, we've been around since 1997, and we became a nonprofit in 2014. And so as you can see, we raise awareness about substance use, and we do that through education with our youth and parents and community at large. We are federally grant funded. We have a Office of National Drug Control Policy, Drug-Free Communities grant, and then occasionally we've also received some Virginia ABC grants, and you can see some of that work there that's been done in our community. We also have a youth coalition, Teens Care Too, so we heavily believe in youth engagement, and so you'll see as we continue in the presentation just some of the ways that we engage youth, and there are some PSA videos there that you can see what the youth are doing to educate their peers in the community. So let's talk about what happens in Hanover. We're going to start with the youth data. So our youth historically has been alcohol and marijuana as our top substances of concern. And in recent years, it actually has been alcohol, e-cigarettes, and then marijuana. And so that might not come as a surprise to you. But the one thing to point out here is that actual use is actually lower than the perceptions youth have of their peers and the substances that they use. And so that's a big component of what we do with Hanover Cares as well, is trying to promote those social norms that all youth are not using. So then also when we look at youth, we look at access, and a majority across all the different substances report primarily that they buy it from a store, they take it from home, or they get it from a sibling. And you can see the disbursement of the substances there on where they're accessing things. Of course, something like marijuana that you can't get in the store, that's going to have a different response. So then we move into our young adult population, that's our 18 to 25-year-olds, and we ask them what's the biggest substance use issue that they see in Hanover County. And you can see here on the graph, they rated it as underage alcohol use and binge drinking, and also nicotine use, which can be tobacco or e-cigarettes and all nicotine products, and then marijuana and prescription opiates. So we also asked them about perception of risk or harm, and you can see that a majority think that it's only a great risk to drink after driving when having 4 or 5 drinks. And then a majority also think that it's great risk to use heroin. When we look at the other substances, there's great variety there, so not as much perception of risk is perceived there. And the same here with past 30-day use. You can see when it comes to reported use of 1 day or more, alcohol, again, is there. And so we also have marijuana and our e-cigarettes. And so that's actually pretty consistent with what we saw in our youth survey data. So then we also looked at access to prescription drugs to get high, and we can see that a majority report that they buy them from a drug dealer or a stranger, and then from friends or relatives, or even stealing them from friends or relatives. So that's an interesting perspective. So then we polled the adults in the community and asked them how serious a problem was various substance use, and you can see that a good amount actually reported that marijuana use by youth in the community was a serious problem, as well as underage alcohol consumption. And so you can see the variance in that data there. And then we also like to assess what parents believe is okay for their children to do. And so it looks like a majority actually think that it's not okay for children to drink underage, which is great. And a majority also feel that it's not acceptable to provide alcohol in their home. And so that's a big proponent of what we do with Hanover Cares, is trying to encourage those social norms. And storage access, that's another big one. And you can see that 60% of the respondents actually indicated that they do not lock or secure their alcohol in their home. So when it comes to prescription medications, a majority, as you can see, indicate that they do not, in fact, lock or secure the medications that are in their home. And that's a concern for us because we know how easy that is for someone to access that unintentionally or to use it in a non-intentional way, and especially with the rate of overdoses. And we don't want our youth exposed to that as well. So the interesting perspective is when people were asked about their prescription medications and what they do with them when they're left over, a majority actually indicated that they keep them to use in the future. And then a majority also indicated that they utilize the drug take-back days in the community to dispose of those medications. When it comes to prescription painkillers, a majority that took the survey actually said that they never had prescription painkillers, but then others, again, indicated that they also keep those to use in the future or they dispose of them at drug take-back days. And so what's our response in Hanover County and with Hanover Cares? So of course, as a coalition, we are engaged as a collaborative effort. And so some of the projects that we do are Just Say Something, which is our parent engagement and communication campaign. Hidden in Plain Sight, you all may have heard of that, where we set up a mock teen bedroom and allow adults in the community to come and snoop for different indicators of drug and alcohol use. Cafe Conversations is one for middle school youth and their parents, where we encourage conversations in the home. And we also distribute conversation jars and journals at those events. And then our Safe Homes initiative, we give out lock boxes and drug disposal bags. And so first responders were also given the You Are Worthy bags, and some of these materials and resources are included in them. And then, of course, youth are engaged in our community responses as well. And so that's another just important component to always engage youth in this work. So let's talk about some impacts. We're going to start with marijuana and just some legalization. So if you follow General Assembly, you will have noticed that marijuana legalization has been on the ballot the past couple of years. Even here in 2020, it actually still did not pass legalization in Virginia. However, what did pass is what's deemed as medical marijuana, but CBD and low concentrations of THC. So I won't elaborate on that too much, but there's a lot of new information, and as of July 1st, 2020, marijuana decriminalization is also here in Virginia. So is all marijuana the same? These are 3 different strains, and the point of sharing this with you today is really for you to know what you may be encountering in the field. And so if you were to see this being grown, of course, by the shape of the plants, you might be able to indicate what's being grown and also what the response will be. And that's important because the behavioral response might be what you encounter when you go into a home where someone may have used this substance or have been exposed to this substance. And so we look at indica, and that's more of the relaxing strain, whereas sativa is more of an upper, or they call it sometimes a daytime strain. And then a hybrid is going to be a mix of the two, and you can see the different shape variations there. Then this slide is just to tell you a bit more about the levels of THC and just why marijuana concentrations and potency levels are just so high today and why that has changed the landscape of marijuana. So as you can see, just progressively over the years, the concentration of THC, which is the psychoactive component in marijuana, has grown exponentially. And when it comes to concentrates of THC, you may have even heard these terms such as dripping or dabbing. That's talking about high concentrates of THC, and it's often melted down into a wax. And so those are just some pictures and some examples there that you may have seen or that you may come across in the field as well. And so when we talk about substance use with Hanover Cares, we always focus on the brain and the brain science. And so when we're talking about marijuana specifically and how THC affects that behavior, you can see how the cannabinoid receptors, how they play out with THC on each of those receptors. And so just some of those long-term impacts, as you can see, might be anxiety and depression, lack of motivation, poor academic performance, memory loss, respiratory problems. And so because marijuana is not legal in Virginia, we look to the other states where it is legal, such as Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and there's a organization in Northern Virginia called Smart Approaches to Marijuana, or SAM for short, and they've done a lot of the research and the studies for us to be able to provide this information. And so what we do know from that is in Colorado, since legalization, this is the data that we do know, and they're seeing more emergency room visits for one, more traffic accidents and fatalities amongst those accidents, as well as an increase in crime, among other things. And this also has a role in the workplace as well. As you can see, more employees are also testing positive for marijuana use in the workplace among those states that have legalized. And then marijuana cultivation or growing is also another challenge. As marijuana, as you may or may not know, it takes a great deal of electric consumption, water and energy, and you can see there it says 300 million gallons of water is needed per square mile for a grow. So that's a huge impact on the economy as well. And so, of course, in the landscape, we talked about the three substances that we tend to focus on with alcohol, marijuana, and e-cigarettes. Vaping and marijuana has actually been a hot topic in the news lately. And so there are even vape devices that are made specifically for marijuana to be used in rather than nicotine-based products. And so this is just one example, Pax Era, which they are also owned by the same company as Juul. And so that brings me to EVALI, or e-cigarette and vape-associated lung injury. And so you may have seen this in the news just as recent as earlier this year, with people showing up to the emergency room with lung illnesses or injuries and not really being understood as to what the symptoms were. And then most of them were actually traced back to e-cigarette use. And so the thought was, and with some of the further research that had been done, was that vitamin E was being found in some of those vape juices or e-liquids, and that is what was causing some of those respiratory illnesses and failures. So the point being, this is why we tell our youth and our young adult population that e-cigarettes really are experimental. And so I think this is something, too, that is still being learned about and even more interesting currently in the current landscape with COVID, as that really impacts the lung functioning as well. And we're talking about vaping impacting lung functioning. So the one thing that people don't often realize is that marijuana can impact the user, but also the non-user. And so there are some environmental concerns. I mentioned the electricity, the water use, and that's primarily in the grow houses. But then there are also some concerns, especially for you all as first responders, in what you're encountering in the community. And so here are just some pictures to show you. The picture on the left is basically mold that has grown in one of the grow houses. And so that's really that environmental piece. And so also, if you were walking into that, mold is going to impact your lung functioning and your respiratory abilities. So that's one impact. And then the image in the middle that says, I accidentally bought a marijuana grow house, why even weed lovers should be very afraid. That article actually goes in depth about how people change the wiring in homes and how faulty wiring often leads to some challenges and even fires in some of these grow houses. And people are actually buying homes just to use as grow houses and not actually living there. And so that also exposes the community, the neighbors and the people that live around it. And most of the calls that you'll see in many of the articles, it's from neighbors responding to suspicious activity or behavior. And it often ends up being something such as this. And then I have marketing on there, and that's just, you can see things like Pop-Tarts, which, all kids love. And then they've changed the marketing to Pot-Tarts, and those are just simply edibles. And so edibles can be challenging too. I don't think I said it. They have a delayed onset response, and so people will think that an edible is not responding, and they end up taking more, and then they basically end up in this comatose state of a high and not able to respond, or that's probably when you all are called to the scene. So here's one other example. This is an article from the Los Angeles Times. A marijuana grow house with 1,175 plants catches fire. And so I just put some of the excerpts on here just so you can see that it says this person was arrested on suspicion of utility theft for illegally growing marijuana and also arson. And it tells us that the house had advanced lighting, air conditioning, fans, exhaust blowers, and an air filtering system to control the house's climate and odor. And so those are some of the things that you all may encounter in the community. And often what's seen is that you're responding potentially to a fire or something like that, not intending or expecting to come upon a grow house. But then when it's learned that it is a grow house, these are some of the things that you encounter. This one is just kind of a funny one. A marijuana smoker causes a fire in the field. So this was in Maine. So a guy was mowing his lawn and had a joint. The joint fell, went down the hill, and it actually started a wildfire. And this article is interesting because it's talking about that all these forest fires, basically from unintentional marijuana and people causing fires. And so again, that's another impact on the community, impact on first responders. So this one is actually in Giles County, Virginia. And so I put this in here too to just give an example that we are not exempt from this in Virginia, even though this is not legal here. And so this one has a house fire uncovers more than $200,000 in marijuana. And so the interesting thing here, the excerpt I put was it was only blocks away. So the house was blocks away from the police department and an elementary school. And so that's super alarming, especially knowing just how volatile this can be with a grow house, as I've just mentioned. And so it also says that multiple tanks were recovered. And so I have that image there. You can see the different propane tanks and things, and all these first responders on the scene. And so that's also a lot of manpower and resources that are put into this when there's an impact on the community. Matthews County, Virginia. This was another one a few years ago. And this one just basically talks about how every room in the upstairs of the home had a PVC pipe set up. It had a nice irrigation system, ventilation, heating, light. So these are all the things or components rather of a grow house. And you can see all the marijuana there on the table. That was from what was recovered from that home. And so this is interesting. The Poison Center has seen an uptake in marijuana calls, and they call them synthetic cannabinoid calls. And this one, they were referencing the state of Maine. So they saw a 160% increase just for children alone. And so that's alarming. And you can see Virginia's on there. And so that was basically for all of 2019. So Virginia had about 51 calls across the state. And so the next slide here, you can see that this is basically from January to May, and Virginia was already at 18 calls for synthetic cannabinoid use. So that's quite alarming as well, and I'm sure the Poison Center can provide a better breakdown of that data, but I've referenced the link there at the bottom for this information. This is just a funny little cartoon to just show. It says, vape shop forced to close and weed dispensary opening soon. And you all may have just noticed the number of vape shops opening in the community. And so the thought is that when legalization passes in states, the weed dispensaries open just as fast as like those vape shops have. And so that's really what we would be looking at in Virginia when and if legalization happens. So one other thing that you may encounter as first responders is cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or it's also known as cyclical vomiting syndrome. And so this was more a recent discovery in the past few years, with people showing up at the emergency room with all of these stomach and vomiting symptoms, and not really, the staff really didn't have a pulse on what was going on. And then as they started triaging the patients, they were discovering that they had used marijuana. And so this really became a symptom of that. So excessive marijuana use can also lead to this cyclical vomiting syndrome and cause all of these gastrointestinal problems. And so we think that that has a lot to do also with how it's administered or ingested, and then also because everything pretty much nowadays is laced with something and it has so many chemicals in it. And as I previously mentioned, some marijuana is being vaped. And so we can just think about the various nuances that this may pose and why we may be seeing more of the CHS. That's what it's termed, CHS. And so in Virginia, we have 5 health regions. And so since Virginia passed the CBD and low THC law, we actually have a medical marijuana dispensary that is being built and slated to open here in Richmond, and that's in Manchester, if you're familiar with that area. And so basically this is just showing how this is in our region. And so just because this is in Richmond, we need to be aware of this in Hanover as well. And so while this is medical and people will require a prescription for it, there's a lot of gray areas and loopholes in this, and something that we just need to be vigilant on, especially being out in the community and when responding. So we talked about marijuana. What are some other things? Of course, opiates, and nowadays more of the opiates are laced, or there are other synthetic derivatives. And so I want to talk a little bit about fentanyl exposure, because I know that that is super common in you all's response in the community. And so fentanyl is just super dangerous because it's 50 times more potent than heroin. And we've really seen a majority of the substances, even in the region, for the most part, are laced with fentanyl. So why this is a concern is because fentanyl, of course, can be absorbed through the skin or inhaled if it's airborne. And even your police dogs can be in danger. And so it's just a super critical substance to be exposed to. And so the CDC has actually come out with an illicit drug toolkit for first responders. And so I put this context here just for you all to see. But really what this covers is just the importance of having your PPE or personal protective equipment when you're in the field, and especially when you're responding to these calls, because you really don't know what you're responding to. And so this really just walks you through all the steps, all the procedures, and I have the link there that you can click to get all of the information in the toolkit. So I highly recommend checking that out. One key thing I would like to point out here is don't use hand sanitizer. And I know in the landscape of COVID, we all are using hand sanitizer. But if you're responding to a call and not quite sure what you're being exposed to, don't use hand sanitizer, because that can actually help a substance absorb into your skin. And especially if it's something like fentanyl, which is super deadly, that can really enhance the chances of that drug getting into your system. And so these are just the different ways that you may come in contact with some illicit drugs, and just things to be mindful of, really, because you can obviously, when you're inhaling something, touching your eyes, nose, or your mouth after you've responded to a call. And so all of these really, I'm sure, are just, these are just methods to reiterate your safety and, of course, again, that PPE when you're out in the field. And I talked a little bit about the risk to canines. And so I thought that this was interesting too, and not something that everyone thinks about. But these are a couple of articles, and even the Poison Center has actually been trying to notify first responders of the potential exposure to the canines during responses for fentanyl exposures. And I think this is mainly because dogs, of course, are sniffing and they're getting close. And so we just have to protect them as well. So gray death, that's basically a mixture of heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil. And so these are all synthetic opiates. And so this potent mixture is really some things that people are seeing on the street now. And you can see what the image illustrates is really the amount that it takes to be fatal. And so you can see fentanyl, it's a little less than heroin, and then carfentanil is really just a very small amount. And even that small amount is even more powerful than just a non-cut dose of heroin. And so the last substance I would like to cover is meth, or methamphetamine. And so this image really just illustrates 10 years of meth lab locations. And so you can just see kind of where it's concentrated. And while there aren't too many in Virginia, just based on this map, it's not exclusive that it's not in Virginia, and so it is something that we want to, again, be vigilant of. And this map is from the DEA in HIDA, or High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. They also collect some of this data through their OD map system. And so a traditional meth lab, you can kind of look and see some of the things that you might find in it. Even from things like an unusual strong odor. Some say it smells like a cat urine or ammonia. You might even find coffee filters and things like that all over, open windows to ventilate. So there are a number of common signs that you might see for a traditional meth lab, but it's super dangerous, and it also takes a collective response to even really go to that scene if in fact, you know that you're responding to a meth lab. And even in the Richmond region, these are seen around. So again, we're not exclusive in the Richmond region. And so again, something to be vigilant of as you're responding. So there's also something called one-pot labs, and those are actually more common with meth right now. And that's basically just a one pot or one bottle method. And so you're seeing these typically more like at your department stores, in public places like schools or restaurants, things like that, but also at homes as well. And so these are thought to be a little bit easier to make. And so you can see all the components there on the right that it takes to do a one pot lab. And so these are also items that you can pretty much just go into your traditional store and purchase. It might be cause for alarm if someone's literally going and purchasing all of these items, but at the same time, would a cashier at a store really know that all these items can be used together for this meth one-pot lab? Maybe or maybe not. But so if you were to encounter this, here's just a list of do's and don'ts. And so, of course, it's just safety first. And so really this is just about being aware, bringing awareness to what people are doing, and that you might also be responding to a traffic safety stop or something else where you're thinking it's one thing and then you encounter all of this. And so meth is just, it's really interesting, super volatile, super dangerous, and not only to you all, but to the community. Because it's super explosive. And so this could even harm a neighbor or someone close by. And so this, again, this is called the shake and bake. or one pot. And the reason, the traditional name is one pot, but recently it's been called the shake and bake, because you literally put all of those ingredients into the bottle and you shake it up, and that's considered like the bake. And so where it becomes explosive and volatile is when the oxygen is trying to escape, and by opening the bottle. And so, people are also throwing these down in the ditches, on the roads. And so if you come across this, the main thing is to not encounter the substance. Don't open it, because that's for a super dangerous situation and can really pose a great danger to whoever's opening that bottle. And there's even been instances of children in this case that have been harmed by shake and bake method, because of course children are curious and they see something and they go to open it up, and this is just super dangerous in that case. The last one I want to talk about with meth is a newer term. It's called wasping. And basically, that's where people are mixing meth with insect killer or like wasp spray. And so that's really desensitizing the nerves, so to speak, and giving them like this desensitized rush feeling and a state of hallucination. And so all of this is important, because when you're responding, you also don't know how someone may respond with their behavior to you. And so trying to understand and identify the substance, as well as what that substance may do, if it's synthetic, if it's been mixed with something, all of those things play a role in your safety. And so that's why it's important to really have a pulse on all of this and what's happening, not even just in the community, but in our region, in our state, and even nationwide. And so all of this, of course, impacts our legislation, because we want to mitigate risk. We want to keep our communities safe. And so our call to action to you is to just get involved with Hanover Cares, get involved with legislative efforts, be aware, and just understanding those laws, policies, risk, and really just getting involved in advocating for mitigating all of those risks. And here's our contact information and how you can support us. As I mentioned, we're a 501c3, and so there's a variety of ways that we accept donations, and that's listed there. We are on Facebook and YouTube, so please check us out there for even more content. And then I provided a list of information and resources based on the content I covered today, as well as some that are first responder specific, that hopefully will help you to learn more about this. And of course, check out our website, hanover-cares.org.